Good morning. Welcome to worship here at the United Church of Christ of Missoula, Montana. We're so glad you're here. We especially welcome those who are visiting. That includes you, Allie and Ray. And we welcome those who are with us online this morning. We are an open and affirming creation justice church, cultivating joy and justice through the life and teachings of Jesus. As we come from different places to be here this morning, in person and online, we remember that no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you are welcome here.
This morning, our theme is a people's history of the U.S. We know that history usually gets told by the ones in power, the empire, the upper caste, the colonizers, the conquerors. We don't always think of our U.S. history in this way. However, if we look at it, we have developed a collective colonizer fable. A fable that the first colonists were oppressed by the British Empire and fought valiantly to win independence from taxation without representation, to secure life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And with those core values, birthed a new nation grounded on the foundation of shared power, equal representation, and justice for all.
But this is only a partial truth. We know there are other truths in our land that have not felt like liberty, life, or happiness, and are not always told. We know a lot of people did not fit into the all of our national fable. The Christian journey calls us into empathy and reconciliation always starts with truth-telling. Today, we start with a more expanded version of our historical truth.
So our worship this morning will be maybe atypical. We'll have a longer litany up front. It'll be basically most of the thing. And to help us, I invited good friends Ray Combs and Allie Lakeo. Ray is a teacher, especially around indigenous issues, native issues, a history of the U.S. from native perspectives, and we've been working together for a few years. And Allie is a organizer with Welcome Back in Missoula here, and also with Common Good, and we've worked together on different projects through Common Good. And I just want to thank you both so much for being here and joining us. And there'll be a chance to share, and also after worship for conversation if anyone would like to stay. And so we invite you to stand for our opening hymn.
Hymn 588.
Enabling growth, refreshing
Let us pray. God of all the nations, every people, and the entirety of life, you call us into deep love, healing, and right relationships with all. Help us to be the bearers of the truth that moves toward understanding, empathy, open hearts, and real change in our community. Amen.
So we'll start with the leadership of the Nez Perce. Joseph, the younger, succeeded his father as leader of the Wallowa Band in 1871. Before his death, the latter counseled his son.
There's a little background on Nez Perce. That means pierced nose. But with so many other things in native history, it's a misnomer by a French fur trapper who's happened to see a person with a bone through his nose in attendance with the Nez Perce, so they became the pierced nose people. So this is Joseph, the elder, talking to his son first. It's a back and forth conversation. The elder, my son, my body is returning to my mother earth, and my spirit is going very soon to see the great spirit chief. When I am gone, think of your country. You are the chief of these people. They look to you to guide them. Always remember that your father never sold his country. You must stop your ears whenever you are asked to sign a treaty selling your home. A few years more and white men will be all around you. They have their eyes on this land. My son, never forget my dying words. This country holds your father's body. Never sell the bones of your father and your mother. And Joseph was heard to comment, I clasped my father's hand and promised to do as he asked. A man who would not defend the father's grave is worse than a wild beast. And this is the younger Chief Joseph again. The earth was created by the assistance of the sun, and it should be left as it was. The country was made with no lines of demarcation, and it's no man's business to divide it. I see the whites all over the country gaining wealth, and I see the desire to give us lands which are worthless. The earth and myself are of one mind. Perhaps you think the Creator sent you here to dispose of us as you see fit. If I thought you were sent by the Creator, I might be induced to think you had a right to dispose of me. Do not misunderstand me, but understand me fully with reference to my affection for the land. I never said the land was mine to do with as I choose. The one who has a right to dispose of it is the one who created it. I claim a right to live on this land and accord you the privilege to return to yours.
As we begin, let us recognize and remember that across our continent, we are meeting on land that has been historically and currently inhabited by Indigenous people and First Nation tribes. We recognize that before colonizers came, there were millions of people already living here within hundreds of tribes, all with complex language, governments, spiritual practices, technology, and deep understanding of and rootedness to this land. Help us be seekers and tellers of truth.
We acknowledge that the original and ongoing sin of our country was the systematic genocide of First Nation peoples and the taking of their lands, tribe by tribe, over many decades. In addition to the deadly impact of diseases, wars, and genocide, many indigenous nations were removed, relocated, dispersed, concentrated, or forced to migrate. Often, such removals and relocations destroyed indigenous peoples' ways of life, which resulted in substantial additional loss of life. God of all life, help us be seekers and tellers of truth.
In Missoula, we live on land that has been home to the Salish and Kalispel people for thousands of years. We acknowledge the Salish were lied to in the Hellgate Treaty of 1865, were pushed and eventually forced from the Bitterroot Valley up to the Jocko Valley in 1891. We also acknowledge that the settler tools of the Allotment Act and mandatory boarding schools for Native children continue to break down tribal sovereignty, culture, language, spiritual practices, tribal unity, and strength for many years. We acknowledge that, as Blackfeet Community College President Brad Hall said, all of Indian country in Montana is still reeling from the trauma of boarding schools.
God of all life.
Help us be seekers and tellers of the truth.
We also remember the capturing and transporting millions of African people in this country who had to live and work as slaves on this land for 246 years until 1865.
A reading from Frederick Douglass, July 5th, 1852. What, to the American slave, is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him whose celebration is the shame, your boasted liberty and unholy license, your national greatness, swelling vanity, your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants and brass-fronted impudence, your shout of liberty and equality, hollow mockery, your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgiving, with all your religious parade and solemnly are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impurity, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States at this very hour.
Since the abolition of slavery in 1865, we also acknowledge the racist and systematic policies and practices of Jim Crow laws that severely restricted Black people's ability to work, own businesses, and live freely. We know that most cities in our country practiced segregation, redlining, which only allowed Blacks to live in certain neighborhoods, various forms of intimidation, terrorism and violence, and profiling, including in Missoula. God of all life, help us to be seekers and tellers of truth.
In addition, over the last 150 years, we have developed many federal, state, and local laws that resulted in the prison industrial complex that has incarcerated millions of Black men and women, as well as many thousands of other people of color. We know that similar stories have been true for Native, Latino, Jewish, Muslim, Chinese, Japanese, and many other peoples in this land. God of all life,
So these actions have created generations of trauma, structural racism, and deep inequities that continue for Indigenous, Black, and people of color to this day. We confess that our governments and institutions, including churches, have too often been silent or complicit in these actions, which has helped to feed the myth and power of white supremacy in this country.
God of all life.
Also acknowledge that the all of our Declaration and our Constitution does not include women. We know that women have been seen and treated as second or third-class citizens who have had to fight for basic respect and human rights, including the right to own property, vote, hold political office, speak openly in public meetings, make their own medical choices, have productive work careers, and live without the threat of violence from men. We acknowledge these fights are not over, and that similar battles for respect and human rights continue for LGBTQ and Two-Spirit people. God of all life, help us be seekers and tellers of truth.
We acknowledge that the all of our Declaration and Constitution also does not include four-legged, flying, swimming, and crawling people, that is, the animals and the creatures of the land, and even the rivers and the lakes and the land itself. We remember the ecosystems that have been destroyed, waters poisoned, mountains hollowed out. We remember the millions of buffalo killed by settlers almost to extinction to help disseminate the Plains tribal people. We also remember the intentional killing for sport or food and the loss of habitat that has decimated many other species to the threat of extinction, including the wolf, the grizzlies, spotted owls, the pallid sturgeon, bull trout, whooping crane, wolverine, lynx, panthers, condors, manatees, kit fox, various frogs and toads, butterflies, tuna, sea turtles, and many more. God of all life, help us be seekers and tellers of truth.
We acknowledge that our own Christian faith has been manipulated to justify these actions, including the papal bulls called the Doctrine of Discovery in the 1400s, which claimed that Europeans who discovered lands that were not Christianized could seize those lands and either enslave, convert, or eliminate its inhabitants. Manipulations also included the dehumanizing of indigenous and Black peoples in the Declaration as merciless Indian savages. The idea of manifest destiny, that it's God's will that we have this land. The blessing of slavery as a God-given right. The outlawing of indigenous teachings and faith practices as the devil's work up through 1978. The church-run and federally funded Indian boarding schools set up for the purpose of forced assimilation to Western values, cultural genocide, and mandatory vows of Christian belief. Also, that men are closer to God and are the God-appointed head of their households. And that the point of Christianity is to get to heaven so we don't have to worry about the earth, to name a few. God of life, help us to be seekers and tellers of truth.
We recognize the enormous wealth and power that was built for white people and for men through these actions. We acknowledge the privileges of safety, security, and unfettered pursuit of happiness that these actions provided for settlers of European heritage and their descendants. God of all life, Help us be seekers and tellers of truth.
We are aware that our community must face the death of normalcy. Our best way forward is through truth-telling, deep understanding, relationship building, and the work of reparative justice. It is time to honor the wisdom, resiliency, agency, connections to the land, and vision for our future that Indigenous people have been carrying for millennia. It is time to hear the stories of wisdom, spirituality, resiliency, courage, and healing from Black perspectives and from the many other oppressed people and creatures in our land. It is a time for listening, for honesty, for prophetic wisdom, for courage, for prayer in our work. God of all life,
Please rise as you are able, verse 572, verse 1. The scripture reading today is from Luke chapter 4, verses 16 through 21. When he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. Then he began to say to them, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his mouth.
Okay, we'll have time for some reflections from our litany of remembrance. I have a few questions that Ray, Allie, and Janice are invited to reflect on. The first is, as you listen to this litany of remembrance, what comes up for you? And is there more that you'd want to add?
So the 4th of July is a celebration, right, of independence from an oppressive king. But I ask you to think about this. So the original 1,000 tribes that peopled this land to the tune of tens of millions of people when that wrong-way sailor ran his flagship aground in the Bahamas. What about our independence? Think about that. We're the original peoples of this land. and yet we are not truly independent. Even though this government, many governments made promises of sovereign nations. We were to be treated as a nation within a nation with all those rights given to France and given to Germany and other nations around the world. And yet sovereignty in Indian country is kind of a myth, really, because of a concept called plenary power. And that came about as a result of a case in 1903, the Lone Wolf case, where the Supreme Court basically said, they created this basically, well, it's not mythical, but at the time it was made out of whole cloth, called plenary power. And plenary power, in essence, is I don't care how many treaties we signed, how many agreements we made, how many promises we made. I'm the big brother, and we're going to do things my way now. So disregarding all of those sacred commitments that this government made to my people, 1,000 different tribes, plenary power overreaches all of that.
You know, as I listen to this, the thing that comes to me, not too long ago, as y'all know, I work for a nonprofit called Welcome Back. We work with returning citizens, folks that get out of incarceration, drug treatment, and/or county jail. And I was having a hard time, and I was speaking to one of the steering committee members. His name's Bob, an older gentleman, and I'm 46 years old, and I don't believe I've ever been corrected in a way where I felt more loved than that day. And doing that helped me get through what I was going through. And I say that because as I look at this, I see the thoughts, the love, the effort that was put into this to try and help those see the other side, you know. And sometimes when folks bring correction, it's always usually done sometimes angrily, out of anger, out of hate, out of sadness. And when that happens, it's really hard to receive. And I'm just looking at this, and this brings a lot of hope to me, seeing that we could look at the past, know that there was plenty of wrong done, but able to move forward to become a one people. We all might have different tones of color, but at the end of the day, we are all one people. We are all creation, you know, from Creator. And that's one thing I really appreciate about indigenous cultures is we use a wheel, a circle, to distinguish people and how we're all equal and we're all one. And so I just very, very humbled too as I'm stand here to be able to be a part of this. And I really hope that y'all can take this, go home, and really sit with it and ask yourselves, you know, how can I help this? How can I be a part of bringing, you know, different races or different people of color together and be one, ultimately. One other thing, too, that I'd like to add is that Mexican people, Mexica people, you know the word Aztec. That's a colonizer term. The Aztecs were called Mexica. And I say that because there's, if we also look down in history, they used the word, the Negro word, then dogs, and then Mexicans were under that. You know, and sometimes that gets really forgotten. Also forgotten that Mexican people are indigenous folks. And people forget to remember that. And just add that little extra piece of history.
John asked what our response to that litany of remembrance is. And for me, it's a profound sadness, shame and grief and despair, but mostly just a profound sadness. And also it raised for me many questions. How can we do this to one another? How can we keep on to this day doing this to one another? I don't have an answer to that. I just have profound sadness and questions to which I don't know the answer.
Where do you find hope in your work and in our community?
So as a young man, I was probably eternally hopeful and snowed under by the fact or by the narrative that this is a meritocracy, and if you do things right, you'll get what's due to you. And as I've grown older, I've become more of a realist, maybe even a cynic, because I see how the world works. I see how things happen. I see people of color fighting that glass ceiling, women fighting that glass ceiling throughout life. So as a realist, it was kind of refreshing to run across this crazy guy over here. If you'd have told me 3 or 4 years ago I'd be working with a Lutheran pastor, I'd have told you you were crazy. But to me, this is not demeaning in any way. He's not a pastor. He's just a good dude who will listen to anything and anyone at any time. His motto seems to be, come on in, let's break some bread and talk about it, whatever it is. So people like this guy right here give me hope. The recent Supreme Court decision, which dealing with Indian Child Welfare Act, which there was no way I thought the Supreme Court would rule the way it would, given the nature of this court. That's definitely hope, because if that had gone the wrong way, I mentioned sovereignty earlier, that would have been the first domino of the rest of our limited sovereignty that we do have in this nation. And for those of you who don't know, that's not just a simple case of a white couple trying to adopt an Indian child. If you all don't know, the money behind that is with a very rich law firm that has oil and gas companies as their clients and gambling companies as their clients. So there's a deeper meaning there. There's a hidden agenda there to overturn ICWA. And that won't be the last time that they try. Some of the work I've done with John in this community, educating Missoulians, we did a course a couple of times called Wrestling with the Truth of Colonization. Some of you, I'm sure, attended that. That's kind of my passion. And when I see open hearts and open minds like this, that gives me hope. So in many ways, my time here in Montana, about 4 years, most of it in cahoots with John here, gives me little glimmers of hope here and there.
About 5 years ago, I was incarcerated for a crime that I did commit. And at the time, I was going to church. At one point, I was a minister of a church and a pastor, a youth pastor. And when I went to prison, or when I went first to county jail in Kalispell, we also had prison outreach ministry. So when I was in Kalispell, I was under the assumption that the gentleman from the prison ministry was going to reach out to me. There was one time where he was in the county jail, and I was going through for something, and I seen him. We locked eyes, and there was just no expression in his face towards me, and it was just like, oh, it's you. And I really lost a lot of hope, because the very people that said they loved me showed me that there was love with conditions, and I could understand to a certain point if someone does something bad and you don't fess up to it, people shouldn't act like you didn't do it. I believe you need to be accountable for your actions. And I was very accountable for my actions. And with me wanting to take accountability, I was hoping that the church was going to not necessarily look past what I did wrong, but help me walk through it, help me to, to become who I was again and not my crime. And that crushed me. It crushed me really bad to see the very people that I spent hours and hours and hours of time with their family, helping them through their troubles, helping them, with their kids, the issues that they had, always come to me and say, oh, I need help with this and I need help with that. You need to talk to him about this. Can you talk to them about that? But when I was in need, what I thought was my family left me, and the question is, where do you find hope in your work and in your community? And I bring that up because when I was incarcerated, I no longer felt human. I felt subhuman. Especially when you are incarcerated, you're not treated like a human. And so when I got out, I had no voice. I'm normally an outgoing person for the most part sometimes, but I'm a very interesting introvert at the same time, and a few years ago, I was supposed to speak at the last legislative session, but I didn't because I didn't feel I could. I didn't feel that I had the right to. But being involved with Welcome Back and the community that I found there, it showed me that there are people who care. There are people that look past your past, that look past your wrongdoing, not in a sense of that you didn't do it, but in a sense that they want to help you recover from that. Because even people that commit crime, we don't always commit crime because we're necessarily bad, but because we have trauma. And of course, trauma is not an excuse to hurt people, but sometimes we do. And my hope comes from finding community, finding people that want to see me excel, want to see me past that people that, and there's this very special lady, her name is Robin, and she was and still is my guardian angel. She helped me. I was at the pre-release for a while, and she would help me, because at the pre-release you can't drive even if you have a driver's license, not even if it's the middle of winter. And she would help me to doctor's appointments, or even when I moved out of the pre-release and was able to be in my own home, she took me to the stores to get all the stuff I needed and really just was there for me as a person. And I think that's one of my biggest hopes is community and finding people, even folks within Common Good Missoula. I'll be honest, for the longest time, I stayed away from John Lund. Like when we would do stuff at Common Good Missoula, I'd only go so close to him. And not because of anything he did wrong, but because of my past and my trauma. And one day we were on a trip and I couldn't escape because I had to ride with him on the way back. And so at first I was really quiet and I was in the back, and he was talking to the other person that was in the car, and they started talking about different stuff and God and this and that, and we got into some really good conversation, and I was like, are you sure you're a pastor that you think like that? Like it just blew my mind, and I'm in a process of healing and seeing how and what and where and how I want to look at my spiritual life. I tend to, at this point, more drawn to my indigenous side of stuff. And, just what does it look like, my future in, spirituality. And John really helped me, and I reached out to him one time, and I didn't end up going this when he was still at Emmaus, to a Bible study that they had, And I guess I just wasn't ready just yet, but just the open arms that John has and the love that he shares and the community, and for you folks to be not throwing apples or rotten tomatoes at us right now is my hope. Thank you.
I find hope in the growing acceptance of science and spirituality as partners instead of enemies. On both sides of that, what has been a long time divide, recognizing that both of them have something to contribute to the answers to our challenges. I find hope in signs that the human species, which has evolved several times, and I forget all the names, but we're now at Homo sapiens, is on the edge, scientists say, of another evolution, which some call Homo luminous, as in illuminated. And then an evolution which will help us to be able to see reality in new ways and have deepening consciousness, which means more compassion. I find hope in the growing numbers of people like you who want things to change and are working for that change and working right now. And finally, I find hope in the presence of spirit, which is a source of courage and compassion and creativity. Courage and compassion and creativity, all tools that we need to deal with the challenges before us.
One more question, which is sort of like the last question, but as you imagine a different story for our land, what might be a hope or a possibility?
So I mentioned sovereignty several times. If we were to have true sovereignty as Native peoples, that would be the first goal. To not have that plenary power over that axe hanging over our head all the time. To truly make our own decisions and not have to rely on legislatures who are spring-loaded to negative where Native peoples are concerned. This one being a prime one. True equality. The Lakota have a saying, mitake o yasi, all my relations, or we are all the same, as Ali alluded to. If you look through the color of my skin, I'm made of the same molecules and particles and systems and organs as you are. I just appear a little different. I don't sunburn as easily. So why does that make me different from all of you here? True equality. You know, we talk about a melting pot. A melting pot is a term that's used for this nation all the time, but are we really a melting pot, or are we more a la carte? You know, the term land back is thrown out there. The ultimate justice would be, hey, we got our land back, y'all start paying rent. Because in truth, you and your ancestors are all illegal immigrants on this land, on Turtle Island. And I can't hold that against you people in this room, but your ancestors did things that disavowed us of this entire continent. We now own less than 2% of our native lands, of our lands that we stewarded for thousands of years. A good start, there was a good article in The Atlantic, I think 2 years ago, by David Trudeau, give the national parks back to the Native Americans. Because we have inherent knowledge, it's called traditional ecological knowledge in current parlance. You know, you want to know how to manage the wildfires better? Ask the Karuk in Northern California. You want to know how to manage the bull trout better? Ask the Salish. They called the intersection of Rattlesnake Creek and the Clark Fork the place of the small bull trout. We've been dealing with these environments, ecosystems, animals for tens of thousands of years. Why not ask us how we did it to incorporate it into current management techniques? And there are little bits of hope here and there. The state of California is incorporating the Karuk tribe fire management practices into their state practices to the tune of 400,000 acres with an eventual goal of 2 million. Why not the whole state? We know how to do things, but since we've been denigrated and denied for so long, We're the quiet Americans. We're the sit in the back of the room and shut up Americans. But we're the original Americans. Reparations is talked about a lot, but only in terms of descendants of slavery. Why is that? The original sin is always called slavery. The original sin is genocide of my peoples and the stealing of our lands. That's the original sin. So why aren't we included in the reparations discussions? And how much would that be? How much is the U.S. worth? I propose naively that every dollar that is economically produced on this land, we should get 4 or 5% of that, put it in a big pot, and split it up amongst the hundreds of nations to build hospitals, housing, treatment facilities, schools. 4%? I think that's more than fair. You know, in terms of reparations, the Japanese got paid reparations. The Italians got paid reparations, some of which we had here at Fort Missoula during and after World War II. So, true sovereignty and true equality. That'd be a good start.
What do I hope for as I imagine a different kind of story in our land? In organizing, we talk about the world as it is and the world as it should be, you know, and in that realm, healthcare, I look at those things, healthcare, jobs, you know, and things of that nature. But when it comes to the sins of this government, it's a hard question, you know, and I fight with this so many times because I myself am trying to decolonize my mind and learn my culture more and stuff. And I ask myself, what does that mean to me? What does that look like? You know, and it's a really hard question for me to answer. But the one thing that I do know is love overcomes all things. Things that we don't know, the things we don't understand. When we show love, it covers and it helps those things. So as the world as it should be, to be a place of love, unconditional love. That's what we need in this world right now, is unconditional love. Because there's so many monstrosities that have been committed in this world, and we can't just undo those things. But when we learn how to love unconditionally and also in healthy manners where we're not allowing like the government to take advantage of us as a people, you know, and love and just seeing where things are right now politically, sometimes there's certain truths that you see, and because of someone's feelings, they continue to stand by certain people in political power because of their feelings and what that person meant to them at one time, you know. But move past our feelings and see the world for it as it is and just love unconditionally.
What is the world I hope for? The same world you're hoping for, a place that's safe for everyone, not just the human people, but the lands and the rivers and the animals and the birds. I hope for a world where there's more joy and less tears. I have 4 grandchildren, and I hope for a world where they don't have to be afraid of all the things that I'm so sad to see that they are afraid of in this world. I hope for a world in which we say, scared is what we're feeling, but brave is what we do.
Thank you all for your answers and remarks and deep sharing. We're going to close this session with the words of retired Episcopal Bishop and Choctaw citizen Stephen Charleston, drawing on his Native American experience to navigate our collective crisis.
So again, just a little bit of history. So we've all heard of the Trail of Tears, right? The Cherokee. That's the only only Native people had a bad time and had to march somewhere. I got news for you. There are 1,000 trails of tears. And the Choctaw are among the 5 civilized tribes, along with the Cherokee in the American Southeast, who they were called civilized because they somewhat assimilated to colonizer culture. The Cherokee had an alphabet, they had a newspaper, they had a church, they had a form of government, bicameral, just like the United States government. So they were considered civilized, and we could live with them for a while. But good old Hickory in 1830 enacted the Indian Removal Act, whereby the American Southeast was to be depopulated of Native peoples. And in the Southeast, this country got a 2-for-1, because they stole our land and brought a bunch of Africans over to work it. So in 1830, the Removal Act, the Choctaw, the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, and the Seminole, those were the 5 civilized tribes. In varying degrees in the 1830s, they had to march to lands west of the Mississippi, which was called Indian Territory, which is now the state of Oklahoma. So that's just a little background for Choctaw. So these are his words, Stephen Charleston's words. We inhabit a period in history that seems to be filled with conflict. The world has become an uncertain place, a dark place, where we cannot see what may happen next. All we know, based on our recent experience, is that things could and probably will get worse. For millennia, my ancestors followed a spiritual path that was respectful of the earth, inclusive of all humanity, and visionary in its transformative power. That tradition has survived. It is one of the oldest continuous spiritual paths on earth. My ancestors' faith continues to this day despite every hardship and persecution it has been forced to endure. I was asked to write a brief commentary about the Christian theology of the apocalypse, the final, terrible vision of the end of the world. I said, my Native American culture was in a unique position to speak of this kind of vision because we were among the few cultures that have already experienced it, an apocalypse. As I said, Trails of Tears, all Native tribes had that, and all Native tribes had an apocalypse of their own. In historic memory, we have seen our reality come crashing down as invaders destroyed our homeland. We have lived through genocide, concentration camps, religious persecution, and every human rights abuse imaginable. Yet we are still here. We're still here. No darkness, not even the end of the world as we knew it, had the power to overcome us. So our message is powerful not only because it is for us, but because it speaks to and for every human heart that longs for light over darkness. My ancestors did not survive the Trail of Tears because they were set apart from the rest of humanity. Their exodus was not a sign of their exclusivity, but rather their inclusivity. In their suffering, they embodied the finite and vulnerable condition of all humanity. They experienced what the whole tribe of the human beings has experienced at one time or another throughout history, the struggle of life, the pain of oppression, and the fear of the unknown. Their long walk was the walk of every person who has known what it means to be alone and afraid. But they walked with courage and dignity because they had the hope of the Spirit within them. Hope makes room for love in the world. We can all share it. We can all believe in it, even if we're radically different in every other way. We no longer need to fear our differences because we have common ground. We can hope together. Therefore, hope liberates us. It frees us from our fear of the other. It opens our eyes to see love all around us. It unites us and breaks our isolation. When we decide to embrace hope, When we choose to make that our goal and our message, we release a flow of energy that cannot be overcome. Hope is a light that darkness can never contain.
May we be people of hope and love. Amen. We'll continue with verses 3 and 4. Please stand.
No more in bondage shall they toil. Let my people roam, nor spill their blood on Egypt's soil. Let my people go down, Moses, way down Egypt's land, let my people go. Oh, let us walk from bondage free. Let my people go. And let us all in Christ be free. Let my people go down, Moses, way down Egypt's land, to let my people go.
Our service continues with our offering. We give to this community, we give to God, we give of ourselves, our lives, our hearts, to the work and journey of love and hope. Let us pray together. Oh God, we help us to be tellers of truth and to see terror and beauty, to be holders of your story, to be holders of possibility, of promise, of unconditional love for all life. Fill us with spirit, compassion, with courage to keep going, to have hope, to connect, to build bridges, to keep loving, to let your love flow through us. God, in your mercy and love, hear our prayer. Amen. I invite you to be seated. We have a few announcements. So there's coffee and there's treats, and you might want to grab something, and you're invited to come back, and we'll have some conversation. And coming up, just looking at the announcements, there's the Wonders in Wildfire Flower Retreat, July 15th, with Janice. I'm pointing to the wrong person. And I know Steve is putting together a backpack trip. The folks might meet for a few minutes after church today to think about some details there on the 28th. And there's the Flathead Lake family camp that there's still room available in August. And also, Brad, we had a great work day yesterday. What would you want to add?
Yeah, great work day. Just a real appreciation. My math tells me 40 hands in the courtyard for anywhere from an hour to 4 hours. A lot of good work done there, and I think we're just going to do this on the first Saturday of the month. Work around. There's a board out there that says all the stuff that we did, and then next to it's the stuff that we want to do. So come out and join us. It's a lot of fun. It's a great opportunity to make community something that we missed over the course of the pandemic, and we have a wonderful time. So thank you all for coming, and I look forward to seeing more of you next time.
All right. Yes, thanks for everybody that was able to help. Sylvia's store, we're collecting items for backpacks for kids back to school. I think one more Sunday next week. So if you want to donate to that, there's time for that. And I think that covers everything. We'll have our closing hymn. This is my song from the Finns. We'll stand for the closing hymn.
Hymn 591.